Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Edible Education 101. Got another wonderful class for you tonight, and the garden is just budding out. It is a feast for the eyes and all the senses. It's something you could think of as all at onceness. That's what Marshall McLuhan called it. Everything's happening at once. Nikiko, these are Arctic nectarine blossoms. How many weeks is it going to be before we have fruit? It's about 8-10 weeks. Are you there?
Depends on, but yeah, we're getting close from bloom to fruit really soon.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Let's see, next slide. We had a great showing of our assignments this week. I wanted to thank everybody for thinking about the carbon impact of your favorite meal. And just wanted to shout out to Andy, Caroline, Rebecca, and Sami for particularly exceptional essays that were both candid, authentic. They kind of showcased the discovery that they each had and also tracked back to the materials in our readings and our lectures. And Andy had this big epiphany that his spaghetti meal, which contained some beef, was actually 70%, would have a 70% less carbon impact if he switched to chicken. But the lowest impact were clearly the plant-based foods, which was not a surprise, but really interesting. Can we do something fun and spontaneous? Think of the number from your homework of your total life's carbon impact from your favorite meal that you calculated. That was the number of times you eat it per week times 52 weeks in the year times the number of years you think you're going to be around to eat that meal. And can you put that number in the chat? I wanted to see if we could get a collective calculated impact for the entire class, all 135 of us that are here today. Just put that number in the chat right now. Can you do that? Here we go. 54. Thank you, Michelle. I'm not going to wait too long, but everybody, I'm asking you to do this. It might even count for your attendance. Who knows? So just throw those numbers in here and we will dump them into a calculator and get back to you. Next slide, please. While everybody's doing that, Eva, big announcement. Just wanted you to know that thanks to the forces of nature and the tenaciousness of your teaching team and their incredible network, we are going to have the one and only Questlove as the final guest of the season, April 28th, 2021. Be there. More to follow. Now, next slide, I would like to introduce to you our guest for this evening, our guest host, professor, teacher extraordinaire, Professor Liz Carlisle is here to lead the class. Liz is a favorite of edible education. She got her PhD at Berkeley. She's on the faculty at UCSB. She's an expert in agroecology, regenerative agriculture, food justice. She's an all-star. We are so happy to have her lead tonight's class. Liz, over to you, please.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Will, and for the invitation to be here. It's really such an honor and a privilege to be part of this special edible education series, Seasons of Social Justice, and particularly an honor to be in dialogue with the featured speakers that I'm sharing the Zoom stage with this evening. And as for why I'm here very humbly as a writer and researcher who's still really early in my own learning journey about land justice. So I'll be listening and learning along with all of you. And I think the reason that Will asked me to be sort of a guest host this evening is a research project that I got started on a couple years ago with a friend of mine and colleague, Maiwa Montenegro. and a bunch of our colleagues. We came together as educators and technical assistance providers out of really shared frustration, to be honest with you, that the students and clients that we were working with were facing so many barriers in achieving their dreams around ecological agriculture and land stewardship. And this was extremely frustrating to us because we believe that this work is incredibly important. And we saw people who had such important work to do around climate, around food insecurity in their communities, around revitalizing rural economies. Why would we not all support people in doing this work? And yet they face so many barriers. And so we came together as a research team to try to systematically document what these barriers were, and to start looking at what some solutions might be. And one of the biggest things that we saw was the barrier of land access and secure land tenure, that this was preventing so much of the good work that we wanted to support. And that really led us to ask some deeper questions about, why is farmland so locked up? Why is it so concentrated? Why is it so difficult for people to access? What is the structural history behind this land injustice? And how can we really address the root causes of that structural history in order to realize land justice, which is an absolutely essential component of any transition to ecological agriculture? So that's what brings me to this conversation. And in the second half, I'll share with you a few of the key things that I've learned in the course of this research, which again, I see I'm still very early in this learning process. But before that, we have the opportunity to hear from someone whose expertise and experience on these questions of land justice is so much deeper and broader than my own. And she can also ground us in an Indigenous perspective on land justice, which is where this conversation needs to begin. So I will just tell you this, just the tiniest sliver of the distinguished background of our featured speaker here, because otherwise I would take all of her time. But just to give you some introduction to A-dae Romero-Briones. A-dae is Director of Programs for Native Agriculture and Food Systems at the First Nations Development Institute. Before this, she was the Director of Community Development for Pulama Lanai in Hawaii. And she's also the co-founder and former executive director of a nonprofit organization in Cochiti Pueblo, New Mexico. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in public policy from Princeton University, as well as a law doctorate from Arizona State University's College of Law, in addition to an LLM degree in food and agricultural law from the University of Arkansas. She's written extensively about food safety, the produce safety rule and tribes, and the protection of tribal traditional foods. And she's also a US Fulbright scholar. So without any further ado, I hand the Zoom room over to A-dae Romero-Briones.
Thank you so much, Liz. And again, it's such an honor to be here. Oh my gosh, Questlove, oh my gosh. That's pretty amazing. And before we start tonight, thank you all for all your calculations about carbon. I think I'll touch on part of that in the presentation. And I'm gonna just give me a moment to share my screen. So hopefully you see my screen. I hope this is the right screen. Maybe it's not the right screen. Let me try one. Do you see, okay, do you see my screen moving?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my name is Gwetsi Se Hopa Hin Waka Nime Asa Watyats Kotietime Osita Koi Mahada. In my community, it's really important that you introduce yourself, who your family is, where you come from, because it's the start of communicating to someone else what lands you're tied to and what experiences you bring to the conversation. So much in the same way, I'm introducing myself to you in hopes that you can think about where you come from and what experiences you bring to this conversation, so we can really dedicate this space to not only opening our minds to the conversation that we're having about really important topics like land justice and history and land tenure and property rights. These are all very heavy topics, and so they deserve space both in our mind and in our hearts and in our spirits, and that's how we start the conversation. Goetzi se hopa. Again, my name is A-dae, and this is the lands I come from. I am now married in Big Valley Rancheria, which is in Lakeport, California. My husband, Fred, and my daughter, AJ, and my son, Lanai, are all from Big Valley Rancheria. So now California is our home. And just that little brief introduction about me, we're going to get started in really delving into Indigenous perspective. So I'm going to do with you as my grandparents and all our grandparents do with us. We're going to return back to the places of our childhood, and we're going to get to draw and do some art and use that to really dig deep into what we're about to talk about. So on my next slide, I will have the instructions. Okay, so our instructions are, I want you to just take a few minutes again to think about where you call home and where you consider your roots laid, and think about that experience. And I want you to take a few minutes to think about a pattern from that place and draw it. I'll give you 2 to 3 minutes to draw it. And then we'll go to group discussion to talk about these patterns and where they come from and why you chose that pattern. So we'll give you 2 minutes. Hopefully you have something to draw with and write with, and start drawing. Okay, so just a few more minutes, and then we're gonna send you off to breakout rooms so you can share out the 3 questions that hopefully you see on the screen, which are, why did you choose this pattern? Where did it come from? And when you see this pattern, what are you reminded of? And I can't share my screen and see the controls. Jordan, are you able to send people to breakout rooms?
I will do that right now, A-dae.
Perfect.
How many minutes do you want?
Let's give 4 minutes.
Okay, 4 minutes, great.
To share out.
That's a wonderful exercise, A-dae. I'm just reading this book, actually.
Oh my gosh.
Buckminster Fuller's Pattern Thinking book. It's new.
I'm writing this down right now. That looks amazing.
Yeah, you would really enjoy it given this exercise.
That's my next book to order.
Do you know Christopher Alexander's book, A Pattern Language, also?
I don't.
Okay, that's another one for your
Pattern
library. He was a famous professor at UC Berkeley in landscape architecture and planning, and he wrote a lot about pattern thinking as well.
Wow. I had no idea that this was a thing, actually. This is just like something our grandma and grandpa do.
You're intuiting it, yeah.
Wow, amazing.
Oh, Liz, look at how similar mine is.
Oh, this can be
Mountains.
Tell me about your drawings and your patterns. What are they?
Mountains and water and tall trees, eucalyptus trees.
And where does that pattern come from?
That pattern just emerges from the landscape of where I grew up, and looking west and looking east. You know, sort of the four directions.
That's beautiful. How about yours, Liz?
Yes, I also come from the mountains, from sort of right between Salish territory and Blackfeet territory. And mountains always feel like home.
Wow. Wait, can I see that one more time? Just both of yours, how similar they are. Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. Wonderful.
Okay, I'm giving people the 1 minute warning.
Okay, perfect.
I'm going to close the rooms now.
Okay. Okay, everybody's returning now. Wonderful. Well, welcome back. I think we're seeing everybody return. Our ticker is going up. So we'll just give everybody a few minutes to return. We had our own little share in our group, our small group, while you did yours. So hopefully you had as good of patterns in your group as we did in ours. And then what is the ticker? Like, how do we know everybody?
We're all back now.
Okay, perfect. So we'll just keep going. Well, thank you for entertaining my idea about the pattern. That is something that we're taught at very young ages. And, you know, in our language, in Cochiti and in many other Indigenous communities, like patterns is how we see the world, and implementation or perpetuation of those patterns, and more recently, disruptions of those patterns are how the world sees us. And so these patterns are really important to center ourselves in wherever we may be. In our group, we shared that some of the patterns came from homelands, from different areas where people feel at home. We saw mountains, we saw water, and that really speaks to how we are formed and how we see ourselves in the world. And in the Indigenous framework, I'm often asked to talk about Indigenous models, and there's really no one Indigenous model. It's really a framework. The framework is like, what is the conversation you're having with your environment? What is the conversation that you're having with each other? And these patterns really inform those conversations. And so one other exercise, I hope you all had great sharing, but another exercise that is often very interesting to me is this, like, what is the pattern? What is the pattern you see in the screen before you? If you want to just put it in the chat, we can check it out and see if people can guess the pattern. I can't see my chat, and I have too many screens. So Jordan, if you see anybody talking in the chat, guessing what the pattern is, please let me know because I can't see it.
Yeah, someone said letters with curves.
Yes, right? Curvy letters and straight letters. And the interesting thing about this pattern is my mom is a professor in Indigenous socialization. And usually Indigenous children get this pattern very quickly. Like they see the pattern, but once they enter Head Start into secondary, I mean, in kindergarten, they don't get the pattern anymore. So this is like a very important, I guess, indicator for the transition from under pattern thinking in your environment to actually written thinking and Western thinking in written form. And again, this is my mother. A lot of what I'm teaching you or I'm going through with you are from her research. She works within the socialization of Indigenous children, and she works on native languages, and I work in food and agriculture and food systems. And so together we have really fascinating conversations about how Indigenous languages and how we see the world shapes what our food systems and our land systems look like. So she's, and if you notice, I picked this picture purposely because you see we're wearing our traditional clothing, and these are all traditional patterns. Like these are patterns that have existed pre-contact. And if you see the patterns in our belts, if you see the pattern in our headdresses, these are symbols and forms that inform our environment, that inform our thinking. And so the belt is a typical Pueblo belt, but it's actually the fertilization of the earth. It talks about the symbol is how the cycles of the earth. So we'll go through that shortly in other slides. And so, you know, when I was going to school, of course, I went to a reservation school, and many of our Indigenous children are brilliant in every way, facet possible. When we talk about children ages 3, 4, and 5, knowing the cycles of their environment, learning what season deer comes, what season fish come, what plants are in their environment. They're very well-trained ecologists by the time they're 5. Except when you go to school, we're often probably the biggest population in many of the special ed classes. And so there's a huge disconnect between how we're educated and how we see the world. And of course, but often we're told like, oh, but you're wonderful artists. You're such wonderful artists, like you guys, and we get praise in those effects. But I just wanted to take some time to look at some of the art that comes from our communities. And I started seeing this in a different way once I went to Princeton, because I actually trained in public policy and economics, partly because I couldn't understand economics, but I loved the graphs, right? I could draw graphs all day long because they were very familiar to me. I understood how pictures work. And part of that came from my framing. These are pots from some older pots, both from Cochiti and from some of our ancestral lands. And they're telling you something, they're telling us something, they're telling us how we should look at the world, how the cycles in our environment function. And then when we look at some of the things that we learn in science and even some of the forms that I've seen in economic circles, like there's an understanding that is both perpetuated in our artwork and perpetuated in the way we think and we see the world. So again, just side by side, like art is often relegated to something other than law, something other than how we look at our food system, something other than science. But in actuality, this is our first book. This is the first way we start to understand how our world functions. We observe it, we see it, and then we actually draw it. And we continue to draw it, and these become the symbols of a culture. And so we see this everywhere in Indigenous cultures, not just in my own community. Of course, that's where I got my framing, but even in my husband's community, which is in Big Valley Rancheria, Lakeport, California, we see some of the same patterns, right? We see important ecological species, we see important cycles on the land being imitated and perpetuated in some of our most sacred art forms, or even in our non-sacred art forms. This is a shakehead, this is a public dance. You see this often when we talk about California Indian dances, and he's imitating a flicker, right? And the flicker is a very important ecological species in many of the Northern California forests. And we see this in Yurok. I'm just giving you examples of like how we frame how we see the world and how we communicate this to our children, and how our kids come to understand their place in this universe. And so social media is really fun. How many in the group have social media? Probably all of us, right? And how much it influences how we think and see the world. This was like our first social media platform, was our environments, like the same way that social media influences how we think and how we formulate opinions, and how it's reinforced is the same way our environment did for our Indigenous children. And so we see the first design on the top is the sturgeon back design. Inside is the butterfly design. So it's a sturgeon with a butterfly, both very important species in the Klamath River and the Northern California Fort Redwood Forest. On the bottom, we see the obsidian design, and these are like imitating rock formations that were very important tools for Indigenous people, and they're actually very important geological measurements in science ecological stewardship measures. So then, and of course the acorn. I'm really fascinated with the acorn, and we often talk about carbon cycles today in regenerative agriculture and agriculture. And it's very frustrating because when we talk about carbon cycles, nobody can see carbon. Unless you have a microscope, you can't count carbon atoms. We have some idea about how it's calculated. So how do Indigenous people understand carbon cycles from an Indigenous perspective? And really, again, when we think about ecological keystone species, when we think about how energy in an environment works, it follows carbon cycles very innately. And so we there's an understanding, while Indigenous people didn't use the word carbon, there are cycles and the way we see certain measurements in our environment happening that mirror carbon cycles. So I often talk about, well, in my introduction, we talked a little bit about food safety. And one interesting, fascinating story that my grandma always told me was that we have a bee plant. We call it a bee plant, walk in my language. And it's it's endemic to New Mexico. We use it for so many different things. And she said, you know, if you don't visit the plants, if you don't talk to the plants, then they're not going to be around. They're not going to feel useful. They're not going to be able to see you. So you need to go visit, you need to talk to the plants. And when we look at that plant and its function in the carbon cycle, and we actually look at the interaction with humans, you know, there's microbial species that are on these plants that actually respond to human contact, whether it be the skin cells on our fingers or whether it be the carbon coming out of our mouths. There's microbiological microbes on these plants that actually respond to humans. And so these ideas often were relegated to places of myth or story or legend, whatever you may say, but actually these are long, true, timed, tried interactions that have occurred over a long period of time, and they're not spoken in scientific terms, but they hold value all on their own. And so I often tell people, like, when an Indigenous person is telling you a story, it's probably a really important story and you should probably listen, because it's not up to them to make the connection. It's up to the younger of the conversation, which is science, to have that conversation. And so when we think about some of these stories, it's really important to make those connections. Also, when we think about, I had this long conversation about creation stories. Often people tell me, the scientific community often says, like, well, we can't really validate like Indigenous creation stories because, you know, the timing's off, or that you all have different creation stories. But in actuality, like the literal translation of the creation stories is that these are the beginnings of Indigenous relationship with that place that they now call home. So it's not like, it may not be like a physical birth, but it's a spiritual birth that connects people to these places that they consider home and they continue to call home. And so when we talk about land justice and we talk about change, you know, and we talk about how we teach our kids to see the world and how they center themselves in this universe and how they center themselves in the conversations with their land and environment. It gets really hard to talk about those things when we start thinking about reservations, when we start thinking about mass people moving from one place to another, when we start thinking about the disruptions that change these patterns in our environment, so that one, we don't have access to see these patterns, or two, these patterns are disrupted in ways that we are not able to keep up with the telling of these patterns. So when there's abrupt pattern change, it's hard for Indigenous people to actually create epistemologies to encompass these changes. So I have this conversation a lot in climate change conversations, because oftentimes people say, well, yes, we need to put Indigenous people at the table. You know, we really need to know Indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. And I have to remind people, like, we are not reverse engineers. Like, if our environment has changed in the last 5 years at such a rapid rate, we don't have knowledge for that. We can't re-engineer what has happened in such a quick amount of time. And so, along with the disruptions in the way we see our environment and whatever policy change or reservations, there's so many policies that have created disruptions in our connections to the land and sea and these patterns. But often with that disruption of pattern, we have like the introduction of a new pattern, a new food system, new things to our bodies that also affect the way we see the world and our place in the universe. And so, I mean, I'm an attorney, so I had like a choice. I could start with talking about an Indigenous perspective, or I could start with talking about the law, because there's so many laws on the books that are pretty disruptive to Indigenous people, particularly California Native people. It can get really emotional for me really fast. So I wanted to start with something beautiful, which is like how we center ourselves and how we center our children. And in fact, like, we are still children. We may be 80 years old, but the universe, the earth is much older. And that's something that is encoded in many of our cultural behaviors in Indigenous communities, is remembering that we are still a very young species. We still have a lot to learn, and that no matter how expert we may purport to be, we are actually still children learning how to live within the patterns of our environments. And so when we talk about California, of course, like, the disruptions to these patterns also began with the way we do land tenure, right? There's this idea that California is such a beautiful place. I mean, nobody can deny that. I think of how blessed I am to be in California all the time. So many microclimates, so many Indigenous people who steward these microclimates and traded with one another. We used to get abalone from California in my community, which is over 2,000 miles away, based on these trade routes before contact. And so it was, California has always been a very special place. And when we think about the unratified treaties, land that was promised to many of the Indigenous communities throughout California, particularly in the Central Valley. Now it's the breadbasket of our country. It's the most productive agricultural lands in this country, but that wasn't by mistake. That was by Indigenous stewardship. We still have numerous tribes in the Central Valley that are unrecognized, and they still continue to steward those lands. Oftentimes, they're part of the migrant agricultural community now. They were actually the first migrant agricultural community in California, because their homelands were some of the most fertile lands, some of the first lands to actually be unceded, taken in California, uncededly taken. And so again, like, I'm happy to share like all the disruption that happened to the patterns of Indigenous thought and how we steward our environment, and which actually led to many very, very disruptive practices in how we think about food and how we think about ownership. And I've just laid three of them here. A very interesting study done by one of my fellow tribal members from the Kiowa tribe is the Land Grab University study, where it looked at the Morrill Act, which is really the first, sorry, it looks like my internet. Can you still hear me? Okay, so I have it here on the screen. Hopefully you can see that. But it started in California, and really it was the start of like extension universities. And when we look at how extension participated in the usurpation of tribal nations to support states and to support this idea of agriculture, it gets pretty emotional really fast for me. The other important, pattern disruption is how we see agriculture. Agriculture is often thought of as like an institution of America. It's thought of the institution that like keeps us all fed. And we often argue about the Farm Bill or who gets resources within the field of agriculture, but notwithstanding or not contemplating the start of agriculture, which is really the start of land grabbing in America, and the point in which indigenous people were separated out from civilized people, according to many history books. Even though my people have been farmers for time immemorial, we have some of the most the first corn seeds that ever came to America pre-contact, and we've always been farmers. But even we weren't considered a community in the agricultural world because we weren't civilized farmers, whatever that may be. And so that is often the standard, and that's often the beginning of agriculture conversations, these very basic understandings. And then we look at the second most disruptive land grab in America, which was the dams to actually support agriculture. And when we think about these two very important institutions in America, indigenous people are left out of both. And it shouldn't surprise anybody that we are often, on the other side of the aisle when it comes to supporting agricultural terminologies or even dams. I mean, the Klamath Dam has been on everybody's kitchen table and mind since they were built. And now we are finally seeing them coming down because these connections just haven't been made for indigenous people. And we're in 2021 and we still have a long ways to go to really think about how we institutionalize some of the most disruptive practices to indigenous land stewardship. And of course, I don't have the answers. I know a lot of law about property and about how to move property in America, but I had to go to law school to learn that because they don't encompass indigenous ideas about land ownership or land stewardship. And why are lands so important is because it teaches us these patterns. It teaches us how we're supposed to view the world. And so when we talk about our food systems and we talk about land and we talk about the transition of these lands to other folks, I'm almost done because I realize we're going over time here. When you meet an indigenous person or see an indigenous person participating in their traditional food system, it's pretty amazing. It's a revolutionary act because it takes so much time and so much mental wherewithal to actually be able to connect to our environment the same ways our ancestors did, because there have been so many pattern disruptions in indigenous land stewardship. And before I end, I have a passage from a book from Scott Momaday called The Earth Keeper. And I will end with a passage from Scott Momaday. He's a tribal member in the Kiowa tribe, which I am also Kiowa, so I'm very proud of him. And I will end with this. So, once in his life, man ought to concentrate his mind upon the remembered earth, I believe. He ought to give himself up to a particular landscape in his experience, to look at it from many angles as he can, to wonder about it, to dwell upon it. He ought to imagine that he touches it with his hands at every season and listens to the sounds that are made upon it. He ought to imagine the creatures there and all the faintest motions of the wind. He ought to recollect the glare of noon and all the colors of the dawn and dusk. And that is from his book, On the Way to Rainy Mountain, which is actually very close to where I grew up. So thank you. Pass it over to you, Liz.
Thank you so much, A-dae, for so generously sharing with us this evening. I want you to see how much we all appreciate this. So I'm seeing it in the chat, but I feel like we should actually applaud you on our video screens here, because I just really want to communicate how much we appreciate everything that you shared with us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been an honor.
Thank you, A-dae. And I will pass it back over to Will, who I believe has a mid-quarter evaluation.
Thank you, A-dae. That was a very moving teaching moment for us all, and we're really grateful for you being with us and for the very important work that you do in the world. And the class is really joining me in the chat now and thanking you. So you're hearing 150 thank yous in unison. I want to introduce to you your class rep, Victoria Stafford now. Victoria is going to lead a brief session to enable you to give our teaching team feedback on how the course is going for you. This is a really important moment in the class, and we really are grateful for your feedback. I'm going to introduce Victoria. It is 6:56, and we're going to come back at about 7:05. Okay, let's see. No, let's make it 7:10. We'll come back at 7:10, Victoria. We'll give you that time. The teaching team's going to leave now, so you can conduct the survey.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm putting the form in the chat right now. And is it okay if I share my screen real quick to show everyone what it looks like? The teaching team might have just left, so perhaps I can't actually show you. But, oh, I'm a co-host now. Perfect. Thank you. So very quickly, here is what the form looks like. So for those who have taken HOS classes before, you know that this is, these 4 questions are kind of a practice that HOS students do for every single HOS class. For those who are unfamiliar with this, the 4 kind of required questions that HOS requires us to ask are: what aspect of the practice should this instructor absolutely continue in this course? Is there anything that we could reasonably change at this point in the semester? The 3rd question is regarding the Berkeley HOS defining leadership principles. So there are 4 leadership principles that the school abides by. That's question the status quo, confidence without attitude, student always, and beyond yourself. I've attached a link here for those who are unfamiliar to read a little bit more about that, but very briefly, does the class abide by these 4 standards as you interpret them and as you understand them? And then reflecting on that, how do you feel like we're promoting that in the classroom, instructors and classmates? And then finally, what else could the teaching team do to promote an inclusive learning environment? I believe this is a new question, but really understanding what, how we can improve to make this class just better for everyone. And then the next few questions are regarding kind of your specific classroom experience. So that's all I have regarding the form. I see we have some quick respondents, so I'll stop sharing my screen. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out over a private message, and I'll just be sitting here. And yes, also very last thing, if you're interested in being a class ambassador for the next year, essentially class ambassador is someone who will work very closely with the teaching team to get the word out about this class. Please feel free to reach out to me as well. Someone who is like a freshman, sophomore, junior this year in working to get the word out about this class and just bettering this class for the next time it's taught. Thank you so much to those who filled it out. We have 82 responses so far and counting. So thank you all who've done that. And this will be open for another week at least. So if you haven't yet, please know that there's still time.
Thank you, Victoria. Thanks for leading this. And thank you for also in advance for aggregating all the feedback so it can be useful to us. Thanks to all the students. I'll bet you didn't know that Liz Carlisle is a famous author. She's famous to me and many other people. She's written 2 wonderful books. One, the most recent, is called Grain by Grain, and the cult classic, the first of her books, Lentil Underground. And one of the things that's so wonderful about Liz is that she brings such a rich, multidisciplinary perspective to her work. And not only is she a very talented researcher and academic, but she is a fantastic storyteller. So I am going to let everyone take a very brief but effective break for 5 minutes and come back at 7:15 so you can hear Liz Carlisle share her magic and storytelling. So see you in 5 minutes. Don't forget to stretch. All right, welcome back. I hope everybody got a chance for at least a little stretch break. One of the challenges is we have so many talented, smart, generous people to have in class that we want to use the time as effectively as we can. Liz, I'm going to turn it over to you. Would you like me to run the poll, or do you want to introduce it?
Yes, that would be great. So I don't think it needs any introduction. We can just fire up this poll.
There it is.
Yeah, so I see the responses rolling in here. How many acres of farmland does Bill Gates own? Yes, okay. I think we've got most folks in there. Should we display?
Sure.
Yes, okay. So we've got, all of these are pretty high numbers, right? And we've got a little bit of a spread here, but most of you guessed 242,000 acres, and you are in fact correct. So this is a launching point here, and I'll start sharing my screen for a discussion about land justice and who owns US farmland and why.
Liz, I looked up today and found out that 242,000 acres is about a quarter of the size of Rhode Island, just to put it in context.
Yeah, that is some serious context. Wow. Okay, so I'm just sharing my screen here, so bear with me for a minute. Getting us to presenter view. All right. Do y'all see my screen? Excellent. Okay, so very much in mind of what A-dae Romero-Briones shared with us, I want to share with you a little bit about what my research colleagues and I learned in the process of asking these questions about why so much farmland is locked up and why it's so challenging for anybody interested in ecological agriculture and land stewardship, and particularly people of color, to access land. And so this is going to be a difficult conversation, but it's a really essential conversation. And I should say also, you know, this is not our knowledge. We didn't create this knowledge. We were writing a review paper, which is to say, humbly learning from the knowledge and experiences of others, and in hopes of gathering this knowledge in ways that it could travel in spaces where it can be used to change things. So we'll talk about a little bit about what my colleagues and I learned, and then we're going to close with some thoughts from Neil Thapar of the Minnow Land Commoning Project, which I think is a really exciting response in California around land justice that really gets to the root of the issues. And I know you read Neil's piece, and Neil really wanted to be with us this evening, but couldn't make the time, but he recorded this video just yesterday. So he's joining us as an asynchronous panelist for this discussion. So land justice, who owns US farmland and why? So we just learned that Bill Gates is America's biggest owner of farmland, a quarter of the size of Rhode Island. But this is not an isolated fact. Actually, many people who are not farmers own quite a lot of farmland in the United States. Many people in the financial services sector. There are many institutional investors who are now owners of much of the farmland in this country, including TIAA CREF. And this is also part of a much larger and very uncomfortable statistic, which is that 98% of the farmland in the United States is controlled by white people. And this is a country where people of color make up nearly 40% of the population, and where people of color account for more than 60% of the current population of agricultural laborers. So this pattern of land ownership is definitely not an accident of history. And so it really begs the question, how did this happen? And as we heard from A-dae, the really important first chapter of this story is the theft of this continent from indigenous inhabitants. So much land dispossession, really in a very short period of time when you think about it generationally. And I think A-dae spoke so powerfully to that rupture and that disconnection, and really how incredible it is that indigenous people have been fighting back and retaining those land connections, even in the face of this enormous land dispossession. So that's a really critical chapter in the history of agricultural land to understand, because so much of what has happened after it builds on that model of exploitation. And I want to talk at some length about the other historical chapter in agricultural land in the United States that also is a model for what we see. It's an important historical story in its own right, a critically important historical story. And it's also important because it helps us understand what the model is that's happening to other people, as well as Black people whose lands have been not just lost, but really taken. But much like A-dae, I want to start on a beautiful note, on a celebratory note. I want you to see if you can travel back in time with me a little over 100 years to 1915. And I apologize, I don't have the picture from this particular parade in 1915. I have a picture from a parade at Tuskegee a year earlier, but I imagine that it must have looked something like this. So in 1915, a crowd of thousands gathered at the Tuskegee Institute in Macon County, Alabama for the 24th annual Negro Farmers Conference. And the festive occasion began at 9 a.m. with a parade featuring 24 horseback riders and 24 buggies, all decked out in the official crimson and gold of the prominent historically Black college. On foot, 300 marchers carried agricultural products, celebrating the bounty of their farms. And the reason for this celebration was an extraordinary fact that 925,000 Black farmers would own their land by 1920. So in the early years of the 20th century, there were hundreds of these conferences across the South expressing the agricultural pride of a people who, against all odds, were achieving their dreams of farmland ownership. And it had not been easy. So going back to the close of the Civil War, this was a time when the United States wrestled with how to incorporate nearly 4 million former slaves into the fabric of society. And at this time, a group of Black ministers approached this fellow, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. And their request was an allotment of 40 acres for each freed Black family. And the general actually agreed and issued what was called Field Order Number 15, which would forever be remembered as the promise of 40 acres and a mule. Within 6 months, Black families gained titles to some 400,000 acres of land in coastal South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and the Sea Islands. And for a brief moment in US history, it appeared that the formerly enslaved might indeed receive some reparation for their unpaid labor. The moment was short-lived, however, as President Andrew Johnson rescinded the order, and most of the land was seized from Black families and returned to their former enslavers. And in the decades that followed, white Southerners would attempt to recreate both the economic and political conditions of slavery by any means necessary. In order to keep Black people, quote unquote, in their place as cheap agricultural labor, white Southerners had to prevent former slaves from purchasing land. Many Southern states passed laws just outright prohibiting Black people from owning or even leasing property. These were part of the infamous Reconstruction era Black codes that outlawed voting, attending school, congregating, and vagrancy, which was interpreted very broadly so that large numbers of Black people could be arrested at harvest season and forced into contract labor as punishment. Aside from these Black codes that just outright outlawed Black people from owning land, one of the most powerful means by which white Southerners thwarted Black people's attempts to purchase their own land was a debt peonage system that looked so much like slavery that observers were often hard-pressed to describe or tell the difference. So under this system, white plantation owners offered many former slaves the opportunity to farm a portion of their land in exchange for a quarter or half of the crop. And ostensibly, these former slaves were economically independent and could build up their savings through diligent work and lucky weather. But the catch was that few of them had a lot of capital sitting around to get them through the season before they got paid for their harvest. So they had to borrow money at exorbitant rates from local merchants who were tightly connected to the planters whose lands they farmed. And the result was often an endless cycle of debt that allowed landowners to retain their labor force indefinitely and dictate most of the terms of their work. So sharecropping, as this slavery in all but name system was called, provided the only economic opportunity that many capital poor and disenfranchised Southern Black people could access. When Black families did manage to acquire land, even in the face of sharecropping and the Black codes, they frequently faced severe discrimination and outright violence. More than 4,000 African Americans were lynched between 1877 and 1950, many of them landowners who were targeted for upsetting the racial hierarchy of white supremacy by purchasing land. So that all gives some context for why it was such a thing to celebrate that by 1920, 925,000 Black farmers owned their land in spite of all these obstacles. We're talking 16 million acres, a full 14% of total farmland in the United States owned by Black people in 1920. And yet this historic achievement would mark not the inception of a new era of racial progress, but in fact, the beginning of a devastating century of Black land loss and theft. First of all, the Reconstruction era practices of discrimination and terror and Jim Crow never ceased. There were laws, there was racial violence, there was exploitative sharecropping that continued well into the 20th century. Secondly, a couple of other really devastating things happened. In the 1920s, the boll weevil decimated the cotton crop, and the 1930s brought the Great Depression. And of course, not just Black farmers suffered from these latter two calamities, and this devastation to rural communities was so great as to spur the first major federal programs to support agriculture. So this was the New Deal and the farm support programs that were part of the New Deal, which on their face should have been really helpful to Black farmers who were struggling economically. They sounded like programs that could help farmers of all races. But critically, the low interest loans that were offered through these programs were administered through local committees dominated by white planters. And these white planters were still pretty much thinking about things the way they had during slavery. Their worldviews had not changed very much. So what happened with these programs, instead of them serving all farmers, is that they actually became a means really to transfer capital from the Black community to the white community. And this was because loans were given very, very disproportionately to white farmers and not Black farmers. When Black farmers applied for loans, their applications would be thrown in the trash, unread, or they'd be kept waiting for hours while white constituents were served. Even when Black farmers were provided with loans, they were smaller than the loans that were given to white farmers of the same size. And then private lenders just followed exactly the same playbook as the government during this period, as did lawyers and land speculators who frequently swindled even their own Black clients. And white tax assessors were part of all this too, jacking up appraisals so high as to force Black people off their land for inability to pay the taxes with these jacked up appraisals. So in the wake of these New Deal farm programs, instead of all rural people who had struggled with these series of economic devastations being lifted up, what happened was that Black people lost their land disproportionately. So the result of this thinly veiled onslaught of financial racism was a tidal wave of foreclosures and tax sales, which ultimately proved more devastating to Black land ownership than the violent mobs of the early 20th century. Between 1950 and 1975, 500,000 Black farms went out of business, forfeiting a total of 6 million acres in the years between 1950 and 1969 alone. And this journalist who wrote this piece in The Atlantic, Van Newkirk, calculated that during that period between 1950 and 1969, this was 820 acres being lost to the Black community every single day, an area the size of New York's Central Park erased with each sunset. Now, for Black families who somehow managed to maintain their land, there was another issue, which was succession. So for many in the Black community, designating specific beneficiaries in a written will was not customary. Land would be passed down to descendants and was held by them in common, which was known legally as heir property. And even if Black farmers had wanted to write wills, few had access to the legal services that would be necessary to create a document that would hold up in a US court. But without a will, this heir property that was held in common was vulnerable to loss. For one, it was typically ineligible for the USDA programs or private loans, which is what basically kept almost all farms afloat through all the disruptions of the 20th century. But more troubling still, exploitative developers targeted heir property. They would hunt down distant relatives living out of state who held a share of the land and offer them cash. And because of the legal status of heir property, a developer only needed to convince one descendant to sell, and that would force the partition of the entire property to be sold at auction. And it's these partition sales that have accounted for over half of Black land loss since 1969. This is such a significant and difficult legal problem that this attorney won a MacArthur Genius Grant last year for his work to solve it. So it was a really long time coming, but government complicity in this mass dispossession of Black land did eventually meet heightened scrutiny. And during the Clinton presidency, tens of thousands of Black farmers filed a class action lawsuit demanding restitution for USDA's discriminatory administration of loans and other farm programs. And in 1999, this Pigford versus Glickman lawsuit was settled out of court for approximately $500 million, making it the largest civil rights settlement in history. Payouts stemming from the case would eventually reach a total of $2 billion. And while this lawsuit did a lot to expose and quantify this discrimination, these restitution payments still amounted to a small fraction of the lost property value and income. And I really appreciate these words from Stephanie Hagens, the descendant of a North Carolina woman who lost her 35 acres to an unscrupulous white lawyer. Stephanie spoke to Associated Press journalists during the Pigford case, and acknowledged the importance of it, but also the work left to be done. And she said, when they steal your land, they steal your future. So this experience of Black land theft, as I said, I think in many ways was a model for how land and labor would relate in agriculture in the United States, which is to say that those who worked the land were not allowed to own it, essentially, and were barred from ownership through multiple legal and extra-legal means. And this from the playbook, really, of Indigenous dispossession and Black land theft. And so we see this playing out even today with immigrant workers. It's been so clear, I think, during the coronavirus pandemic, and this term essential worker being used for people who are growing, harvesting the food that all of us eat. Many of these farmers are Latinx. They make up 83% of US field workers, but Latinx farmers own just 3% of US farms. So it's a similar model of workers being considered essential, but being shut out of land ownership. And there have been many, many waves of immigrants to California in particular who have experienced the same thing. Essential as workers and yet not welcome as landowners or full members of a community, are able to build those kind of relationships with land that A-dae spoke so beautifully about. So I know we're all eager to talk about what can be done about it. And I want to uplift a couple of grassroots solutions that are being offered by Indigenous communities and communities of color. I want to talk a little bit about a policy that's before the United States Congress, but then I want to leave you with some words from Neil Thapar from the Minnow Land Commoning Project, which I think is one of these really exciting, collaborative, very, very deep solutions or beginnings of a solution to this huge, huge problem of land injustice. One of these solutions that's being offered by Indigenous communities right here in the Bay Area is the Shumi land tax from the Sogorea Land Trust. And so this is the idea that if you occupy Indigenous land, you can give some portion of your wealth in order to enable the Indigenous original inhabitants of that land to restore their sovereignty and land stewardship. And this is part of a much larger suite of programs that Sogorea Land Trust is engaged in around Indigenous land justice in the Bay Area. The Northeast Farmers of Color Network and the extended community around Soulfire Farm, the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, have created this reparations map, which is a way in which you can anonymously and directly give to all these projects you see on this map, which are land-based farm projects led by Indigenous people, people of color, who are offering you the opportunity to contribute reparations in land or in capital. So this is also a direct grassroots effort and something that you can engage with immediately. Also, Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, this is part of a larger suite of efforts that they're engaged in, and I definitely encourage you to check out their webinar series. On a policy level, it's exciting to me that a coalition of these grassroots groups are being heard by people in Congress. And there is a bill before Congress right now called the Justice for Black Farmers Act that has a number of provisions, but two in particular around land that I wanted to highlight. One, a provision around protecting existing Black farmers from losing their land. So some solutions around these heirs property issues, as well as financial tools and restitution for the financial discrimination that Black farmers have experienced. But also, and this is really, really new in recent congressional conversations, an equitable land access service within USDA that would acquire farmland and provide land grants of up to 160 acres to existing and aspiring Black farmers. This is before Congress right now. And it is essentially the first opportunity in a long time to go back to that original promise of field order number 15 and 40 acres and a mule and actually make good on it. So this is, I think, really exciting national policy that's been inspired by these grassroots efforts and these conversations among these coalitions. So that's it for my slides, but I want to, as a closing thought, I want to leave you with some words from Neil Thapar. So I'm going to stop this share and start another one. So bear with me here in the Zoom transition, and we'll head over to this video from Neil, which he recorded just yesterday, specifically for us. So here we go. This is Neil Thapar from the Minnow Land Commoning Project.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Liz, for having me here to share a little bit about my work. My name is Neil Thapar, and I co-founded Minnow about a year and a half ago after spending the better part of a decade working as an advocate for structural change in the food system as a lawyer. And together with my co-founder, Mai Nguyen, who you all heard from just a couple weeks ago, we've experienced the food and farming system from inside and out, and what we found in our work is that every attempt at change in the food system towards equity, justice, and sustainability that didn't include changing land relations never really amounted to much change at all. So we kept coming back to the question of land. Who owns it? How they've come to own it, and how those of us who don't have the security that ownership represents are doing in society. What is Minnow? We are focused on supporting the success of farmers of color in California by facilitating the transfer of land into community control to support their long-term tenure within the broader frame of respecting and advancing Indigenous sovereignty. So what do? We raise money from those who manage the stolen and hoarded wealth that was taken from communities of color to purchase land, remove it from the market, and engage in consultation with Indigenous communities to understand their needs and goals for stewardship over the land. And if appropriate, based on that consultation, return that land to Indigenous communities and or support farmers of color in establishing worker-owned farms with long-term land security. And I could talk a lot more about the details, but there's something else that I want to touch on with the few minutes that I have with you all today. So I encourage you to email me if you have questions after the talk about Minnow or our strategy. And Liz, feel free to share my email in the chat. I want to talk about private property. So one thing that I bet you've heard or read, as I have, somewhere in your study around sustainable agriculture or the food system, is that the problem of our food system, and therefore the challenges to land access or access to markets, or whether farming and sustainable farming is a viable livelihood, are based in this idea that our food system is broken. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's not broken. And in fact, it's been working perfectly well and has been for about a century, just not for most of us. From the perspective of most of the people within or outside of the food system, we may see it as broken. But if you take a different perspective and look at it from the lens of those people that created the laws and the systems of capital that determine and have created our current modern food system, it's working just fine. And the reason why I bring this up, and I'll tie it back into private property in just a minute, is that it's important to be clear about what the problem is so that we define appropriately the universe of solutions that are available to us. So think about this. If something's broken, what do we try to do to address that? We try to fix it, right? You got glue, you got tape, you got maybe screws, if you need to fix something. Not a lot of options. And so we are left with just a few options when we think about something that's broken and how to fix it. And we're also using the system and working within the system that created the problem itself. And it reminds me of the Audre Lorde quote, where she says that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So what if instead we realize that the system isn't broken, that it's actually working perfectly well, as I'm suggesting? Well, then what's the approach to solving for the problems that it creates? It's to break it, right? And no more painful or clear example exists than the abolitionist approach to slavery. Abolitionists didn't go around saying, let's put some tape on this problem. Let's make sure that enslavers are nicer to the people that they enslave, or that there's better housing conditions for enslaved people. Those were reforms that were suggested, but that wasn't the solution that was going to transform and make the system just. What was the response that the abolitionists had? It was to break the cycle. It was to end slavery entirely. And breaking doesn't have to be this destructive force. There's 1,000 ways to break things, and it actually unleashes our creativity to imagine possibilities for, sure, ending some aspects of a system that exists, so that something else can be built in its place, because both of them cannot exist side by side. It's also challenging because it means that we need to break our assumptions, we need to break learned behaviors, we need to break with business as usual, maybe break with some relationships that we have, and likely break laws. I know, I'm a lawyer and I'm talking about breaking laws. This might sound strange, but it's because I've looked under the hood of our legal system, both historically and the present day legal system, which is the architecture that governs our food system. And it does need to be broken. And the laws that I think need to be broken related to this topic are those that prop up our system of private property ownership. That's at the core of the challenge to land access and what we're trying to address with Minnow by facilitating the transfer of land outside of individual private profit-oriented ownership and into a commons model or community control and stewardship instead. So even though it's not limited to just our food system, I encourage you to reflect on your own feelings about private property ownership. Where did your assumptions and understanding about it come from? And were you ever encouraged to develop your own perspective about it, or were you socialized into believing that this is just the way it is? And if the answer to that is yes, it's okay, most of us were. And think, for example, why is it that a landowner can profit from land that they didn't create, that perhaps they can profit off of more than what they paid for the land or what the assessed value of the land is in our economic system, just because their name is on a piece of paper saying that they own it? And have you ever caught yourself questioning why our system of land relations are set up the way they are? And what was your feeling when you had that question creep up? So that's what I wanted to share with you all today, and I hope that you're able to sort of reflect on these questions, and I'd love to hear what your reflections are if you want to share them with me. And I'll just leave you with a longer version of the quote from Audre Lorde that I referenced, which is from a speech that she gave in 1984, speaking about the need for white feminists at the time to reconsider their avoidance of the diversity of experience of women of different races or different sexuality, particularly Black women, and draw strength together from that difference as opposed to just merely tolerating that difference or at worst avoiding it entirely. So in talking about the experience of Black, poor, lesbian, and older women, Audre Lorde says, quote, "Survival is not an academic skill. It's learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil, for challenging us to think critically about our relationships to land. And I think that's a great place to close. And I am here. I'm sure you have questions. I have questions. I don't know that I have answers, but I'm happy to be in dialogue with you all. And again, just really honored and really privileged to be on this learning journey with all of you. Seasons of social justice with edible education.
Thank you, Liz. I want to invite anyone to ask a question. You can raise your hand. You can put it in the chat. How do we want to, use these next few minutes? Neil, presentation, Liz, thank you for bringing Neil to us, even asynchronously. I think he exemplifies the spirit of a change maker that we've been highlighting in this course. And one of the things that's so interesting about it is to see people using different tools, different language, but I think bringing to our awareness this semester, probably more than any of the prior 10, an understanding of so many of the factors that are shaping and influencing, constraining, or driving the food system that we don't see, or that we take for granted, or that are invisible to us. And so this, to me, in my experience, my 5th year in the class, this sheds a whole new light on the way we look at, understand, and approach the system itself. And I think Neil's point is well taken, that the system is working exactly the way it's constructed, and it's just not constructed for the majority of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate that both of the speakers this evening are lawyers, are trained as lawyers. And I think they have this really interesting critical relationship to the legal profession, and have both used the law brilliantly. And we didn't even get to that, what A-dae has achieved through the law and what Neil has achieved through the law. Huge things, like Neil's campaign saved public libraries, seed libraries, early in his career at Sustainable Economies Law Center. A-dae has brought incredible food security programs to Indigenous communities across the country, her own, but many, many others as well. And yet they both have, I think, this, really sharp critical analysis of the limitations of those legal tools, and are thinking about justice. How do we need to move beyond the frameworks that they themselves have also been engaging with and using? So I think that's, just really helpful food for thought, whatever profession or set of tools we use, to be able to utilize them and also think critically about their limitations.
Well, I think it's also a wonderful reminder, and for the students in this class who are thinking about, how am I going to apply myself if I want to enter this field, and in what way? And the examples tonight of the legal expertise and just the domain expertise of being able to go deep in an area and understand the context and understand the nuances, whether it's going to be in law or public policy or public health or environmental science or biology or business, understanding the context and developing that deep expertise, which comes from both study and doing stuff. And the final project in this course is really to develop one's own thoughts and plan the pathways that you each want to take as you imagine yourself as a food systems change maker. Where do you want to apply yourself? Where are the leverage points in the system? Both A-dae and Neil are recognizing that this structure of land ownership as a fundamental, like a root cause. And it certainly puts in context, the difference between creating like a new bottled water with mint in it or something. I mean, not to minimize that, but that's a different, that's a different approach to changing public health. Any questions? There's a lot to think about. What I'd like to do is I'd really like to thank Liz, who always comes to class with such clarity and preparation. And I so appreciate you inviting Neil and A-dae. They were extra special guests. And Liz, we consider a member of the long-term edible ed teaching team. Even though she's at UC Santa Barbara, we're happy she's there, but we're also
I'm a proud alum.
Yes.
Always a bear. Always
a bear.
And still blue and gold.
Yeah. So just to conclude tonight, your assignment this week, we started with kind of your own, developing your own awareness and about your place in the food system. Then we're moving into this place of starting to understand how the system works, how it's configured, structured. And we're hoping that you're starting to learn about where potential leverage points are, listening carefully to the change makers we have as guests and identifying these different places that different people are choosing to make change. The next part of the class is to move into the realm of entrepreneurial agency. So even A-dae and Neil, even though they are trained as lawyers, they're actually employing entrepreneurial agency. They're very resourceful. They're very strategic. They're very persuasive and influential. They enroll people in their vision and get them to join and support it and build, momentum for change. So the assignment this week is to start thinking about what's something that frustrates you. What are you experiencing that you have some knowledge of in your relationship to food and the food system that kind of bugs you a little bit? Most entrepreneurs start with an itch that is bothering them and they want to improve it somehow. They want to change it. They want to make it better. So this week, you're going to reflect on what's your frustration with the food system. And then next week, we're going to have another amazing class about who's speaking in the food media world. And we have another wonderful guest host, Tiffany Patton from Real Food Media. So again, I just want to thank, if you could turn your mics on for just a second and thank Liz and thank A-dae and Neil on their behalf. We will bid you a adieu this evening. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
See you next Wednesday.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Liz. Bye-bye.
Thank you.